Welcome to Thea Ward's Digital Case Studies, Segment 2.
We're so glad you're here with us.
I'm Roberta Perry.
And I'm Pat McCoy.
Now it's my pleasure to introduce JRA Vice President Shawn McCoy, who's going to transport all of us to Oslo, to County Wicklow, and to Washington, D.C., not necessarily in that order. Drum roll for Shawn.
Thanks, Pat and Roberta. What's great about the Thea Awards is that all types of projects are celebrated, from the largest of theme parks to the smallest of exhibits and everything in between. And of all these projects, one could argue that museums and cultural attractions have the most impact on us personally, for they help us better understand our history, our world, and ourselves. Today we're going to explore 3 exciting projects which use a variety of techniques from the world of themed entertainment to attract and engage their audiences. Our first case study literally immerses guests within an historic ship to bring its adventurous history to life, like never before. Joining us from Norway's Fram Museum are its director, Geir Clover, and creative director from Sarnar International, Ed Cookson. Welcome, gentlemen, and congratulations on receiving this Thea Award for Excellence.
It's a great honor, and I think it's a first for a Norwegian museum. So I'd like to start our presentation by showing a short film that describes the project. So, what is the Fram? The Fram is a ship specially made for polar exploration. In the early start of the heroic age, the Arctic and Antarctic was the prime goal of exploration, and Norwegian Fridtjof Nansen wanted to explore the Arctic Sea and tried to make a ship that could withstand the pressure of the ice. Most people thought he was mad because history shows that wooden ships in the Arctic are crushed and disappears. But they made the ship with a rounded hull, got frozen into the ice for 3 years, came out on the other side and became a world sensation. 20 years later, Norwegian Roald Amundsen used the same ship on his successful trip to conquer the South Pole in 1911. And the entire museum is based on the stories that took place on this ship, the expedition, but also many other polar explorations from many different countries. After the expeditions, the ship was in a shambles, but in 1925 a group of private individuals took the initiative to form a committee that with the goal to preserve the ship, and 10 years later, all with private money, they had restored the ship and built a museum which opened in 1936 by the Norwegian King and Crown Prince. Over the years, it has gone through many phases of upgrades. Here you see some images from the 1970s and 1980s, and as you see the ceiling is just a thin roof of planks and fiberglass. So one of the first jobs when I started in the museum in 2005 was to insulate the building and also make an elevator and make accessible for wheelchairs all over the museum. In the past, we could have -10 Celsius inside during the winter and +40 Celsius inside in the summer, which was not very hospitable for both the staff and the visitors. In 2011, we started to make further exhibition space inside the museum. As you can see on these images, we also installed lighting and new exhibitions to make the entire museum a better experience for our visitors. But we were still working and thinking and planning how we can get the museum to look and feel like it was part of a polar expedition, and going through all the source material, private diaries from the explorers, their letters they sent home, a massive historical archives, maps, etc. We got a very sense of what it was to be a crew member on board, and how they felt being there, the loneliness, the strength needed, the massive nature experiences they had. And we wanted to, is it a way where we can show and get our audiences to feel more as the explorers did? So we contacted Sarner, made our proposals, and the goal was then to make the Fram ship ready 100 years later. And using the space in the museum, the space around the museum, inside the cabins, and the deck itself to be part of the exhibition and the tour, not only being the attraction the ship is. So the main goal was to stand on the deck of the Fram and then explore a year in the Arctic, to travel to Antarctica, and by using 10 projectors and a 270-degree continuous film, we are able to do that. So we have 11 minutes showing the year in the Arctic, a polar bear passing by, northern lights, wind, etc. So it's become very successful, and it's the main part of the new museum. But also when you go below deck, you'll find a number of new interesting facts. We have included some of the main characters in polar exploration. We have spent several years going through, talking to family members, getting artifacts, making artifacts, and sewing, carpenting, everything to fill up the ship from bottom to top with interesting items, smells, action images, etc., to bring the audience closer to what was going on in the past. Even the engine is a very important historical artifact, being the first diesel engine ever to be put in an ocean-going vessel. And by pure luck, we jumped into a Swedish committee of fans of this diesel engine, which had restored one, filmed one, and we had access to all their work. And Sarner then made it into an amazing attraction by smelling the diesel. We put in an original figure. We have a film showing the engine at use, etc. And moving on to the cabins, going into the cabins, if you go on our website and study the 360 degrees films from all the cabins, you can spend hours just looking at the individual objects, and each of them have a story, and each of them are placed there for a purpose. So it's been an interesting process to go through those details and place it in the ship for the audience to look at. Also the public spaces like the saloon, workshops, storage areas has been treated in the same way, that it could have been exactly like that when the explorers themselves used the ship. the open spaces like the storage rooms and the cargo room, where there's more open spaces, it's been included more interactives and educational films that all are showing and presenting the different activities that took place on board, and also presenting how it was to spend 3 years on 10 square meters or sail to Antarctica and get the time going, working with the dogs, presenting and preserving the equipment that you would use for later expeditions. When you read the diaries of the crew members and they're missing their families, sitting in the darkness, they hear the ice creaking, there's northern lights in the background, etc. And then to have a light bulb with warm light where you can write your letters, write your diaries was extremely important. And that electric light came from a windmill. And to have a windmill in 1893 on a wooden ship in the Arctic is quite a sensation. And when I know how hard it was to maintain this windmill during this process and how important it was for the crew members to get their life through this winter, it was important for us that this windmill has to come back to the ship. So Sarner made us an almost replica of the windmill, and it's now become quite an essential attraction on the deck of the ship. And reading the diaries, we understand how much the crew members appreciate it. So I leave it over to Ed from Sarner that will talk more about the technical issues.
Thank you, and thanks to Gaia for the opportunity to work on this incredible upgrade. Gaia is one of those directors that has this really great balance between, on the one hand, caring deeply about the detail and the authenticity, but on the other hand, not losing sight of the overall vision. How do we tell these stories in the most engaging ways possible for our visitors? Prior to this most recent set of upgrades, we had, under Gaia's direction, already installed a bunch of really great features, and these were already sparking this conversation and helping drive the museum to the top of public rankings like TripAdvisor. But to the museum's credit, they didn't want to just rest on that success. They had the foresight to realise they needed to look forward. And with that in mind, Gaia came to us in 2017 with a whole bunch of new ideas, which were great, not just because they were really authentic, but also because they felt like they had something new to say about the Fram, or something new to say about the amazing history of polar exploration. And looking at this list, I honestly feel that I could talk about some great stories behind any of these, but I will focus on just a couple of them right now. The first is the on-deck projection show that Gaia mentioned already, which was certainly one of the most obvious and dramatic of the upgrades. We all agreed it was a great idea, but honestly, when Gaia first explained it, were concerned how well it would actually come across given the constraints we faced, not least of them being the triangular shape of the boathouse that you can see in the images here. We spent quite a bit of time discussing, do we approach this with projection or LED? And whilst we love the potential of LED in terms of its image, we ultimately chose projection for a number of reasons, not least of them being cost, the ease of maintenance, weight loads on the roof. And we did some on-site projection tests, and it was really these that convinced both us, but more importantly Gaia, that this was going to be achievable. It was going to get the effect that we wanted it to. We still had concerns how we were going to mount these projectors. We didn't want to be ruining a visitor's experience with a poorly placed projector. So the challenge came, how do we hide these 10K projectors up in the rigging of the ship? And how do we spend that time aligning to get the perfect 270-degree image without any shadows, without any artifacts? You guys mentioned there were a number of different states. We had to render all of the video out at 60 frames a second, 18K, and thank you to our fantastic CG partners Moonraker for doing that. The three core states you can see here, the ship being stuck in the ice, the ship moving slowly through the ice pack, and then most dramatically being caught in a storm. And Gaia always challenged us to the authenticity. He was a bastion of providing great research and reference, and he really wanted it to be the details and the accuracy that brought these stories truly to life. And we then complemented the visual projection with a number of other additional features, such as the windmill on the deck slowly rotating, such as this rocking bench that you can see here that really gives you the feeling that the deck is moving. We created a wraparound audio soundtrack as well as spot localized audio on the deck, and all put together, it really is something to experience. For me, I think at the crux of it, it's the fact that you're standing on the actual ship itself, and I've seen so many visitors just transfixed and swaying as they're there riding the Fram gently through the ocean. So I'd like to touch on our work inside the ship, which was without a doubt one of the most exciting opportunities of the recent set of upgrades. Here you can see some images of what it looked like prior to us installing the upgrade. And we worked across 3 interior levels, the overall concept being we were going to pack the ship full of provisions and tools and personal belongings, but most importantly, transform that ambience of being expedition ready with atmospheric lighting, audio, smells, really trying to capture the excitement as if the ship had perhaps just launched and was off on one of its expeditions. Once again, Gaia provided this wealth of great research and reference. You can just see here a sample of the photos and the drawings and the plans we got to work with to make sure that everything was absolutely right. And where appropriate, we love using technology to tell these stories, but we had to be aware that we were working in these very tight spaces and wanted to ensure that the ship and the stories were going to remain at the forefront. And that meant from the very beginning thinking about a very sympathetic, immersive design. And that in turn meant considering how were we going to mount equipment, how are we going to run cables, what are the risks of equipment overheating in these very tight spaces. Here again is the engine room, not just lighting and audio, but also smells and physical rumbles and projection that explored the mechanics of this amazing machine. For us, it's about connecting the visitor to this very visceral experience of the light and the sound, but also giving them an opportunity to inform themselves about the science, about the history. So I would love to go on, but I will stop there. I hope that all of you will one day get the chance to discover this wonderful museum for yourselves. A big thank you to everyone at the Fram Museum, but particularly Gaia, for maintaining that focus on storytelling, on authenticity, and on keeping it immersive. Thank you very much to the whole team at Sana and our project partners, and a huge thank you, heartfelt from us, to the TEA. And with that, I'll hand back to Gaia.
Thank you, Ed, and thank to all your colleagues. We worked together for almost 10 years now, and sometimes we agree and sometimes we don't, and always we get to great conclusions in the end. This project has been really successful, and the audience is really, really liking it, and it's amazing just to sit in the corner of the museum and see the response of grandparents and children and those in between when they walk around the ship and is on deck. But we can't rest on our laurels. We are now planning a brand new building, our 3rd, that will deal with the future. As a museum, we're great at telling about the past, but I think we also should learn from the past, looking at the challenges of the future. And we all know what the Arctic is facing and the climate change issues that we are facing all over the world, and we have to deal with that in our museum. It's very relevant to the story we're telling already, so now we have the opportunity to bridge the gap between the past and the future, and being like a center for learning and interactives, and get those young people become even more active than they are, and teach their parents on the issues we are facing and how we can solve them. It will also give us the opportunity to to have large conference room and cafes, etc., that can bring further income to the museum. As a museum that are totally dependent on ticket income and our own activities, it's important that we go into the future with more possibilities of earning our own money. So in the end, I would also like to thank, in addition to Sarner for all their work, every team member of the Fram Museum who has spent a long time doing their research and doing all the handiwork and hard work to prepare the content of the cabins, from printing and sewing to digital computer work. So it's been a great fun project to work on, and now we're looking ahead to new projects. Here we can see our building, hopefully finished in 2023, 2024. Thank you.
So Geir and Ed, great presentation about what really is a fantastic project. We have about 10 minutes and I've got lots of questions, so I want to jump right into it. Geir, I want to start with you. The Fram Museum has been one of Norway's most popular attractions since the 1930s, so obviously your visitors have loved it for a long time. What do they think about your most recent upgrades?
Yes, in the past they loved walking around the ship because they've heard about it, read about it in school, etc. But now with the new attractions, when you hear the shriek of laughter and the discussions, it's great to witness, and they love it. And well, we're number one on TripAdvisor in Norway, so we can't get higher. But more and more people come, and we're especially popular now with families in Norway in weekends. Normally we have about 80% of international visitors, but now the amount of Norwegian visitors increase every year thanks to the new upgrades. So we're a place that you don't take your grandchildren, but you can go your whole family, and you can go several times to see it all. So it's been really successful, and it's a really pleasure to witness and observe that the ideas we presented really works in practice.
So Ed, why do you think these stories about polar exploration are still interesting and relevant to today's audiences?
So it's a great question. I think it's the same reason that captures our imagination about space exploration. And in fact, polar exploration preoccupied a lot of 19th and 20th century literature and artistic endeavours. I think you've got everything. You've got these tests of endurance. You've got the thrill of the unknown, discovering. But crucially, I think you've got this magnifying glass on our relationship between humans and nature. We know we already have this very complicated relationship, and what is our place in nature? And I think, as Guy has alluded to, it tells us something about the past, but crucially, it also tells us something about the future as well.
Yeah. So Guy, I have a question. So you are the steward for this macro artifact, this historic ship, which some consider to be one of the most important artifacts of the polar exploration's heroic age. And yet you allowed this to be turned into this immersive theatrical experience. Did you have any reservations about how to use this ship and still preserve its integrity?
Well, that's also a very good question, and it has been discussions, and especially with people around us, can you do this and can you do that? But we have been very specific that everything we do is extremely relevant for the history. There's nothing there that shouldn't be there. So like, we wouldn't do everything to entice the audience. It has to be relevant to the polar explorers, the history of the ship and polar exploration. And we also make very sure to protect the ship. So around in the cabins, etc., there's been carpeted, both for noise support, but also to prevent fire. There's new fire security equipment all over, and I think everything we do enhances the story without being overly commercial. So it looks great, but it's still extremely relevant, and there are limits to what we want to do, and I think we will be inside of that scope.
And Ed, really kudos to you and your creative team because from what I've seen from the case study, what you've really done is you've taken that technology that's required to create this immersion and you've made it invisible. How did you discuss that at the beginning of the project, and how did your team achieve that throughout the development process?
So I'm really glad you picked up on that, and also your use of the word immersive. I really respond to how we use it. It's very much that we're trying to tell these stories, and we're trying to make the transmission medium effectively invisible to allow the audience to forget them. So I use the word immersive, whether it's a good book can be an immersive experience, great cinema can be an immersive experience, whereas something like VR or AR, they can be, but often I find you're fiddling with an interface, or you're worried that something's out of focus, or you're wondering why this headset's on your head, and you're no longer immersed. So taking that concept of immersive really runs through everything we try to do. And there's no substitute other than think, is this getting in the way of the story we're trying to tell? As Guy said, it keeps coming back to that. Is this about a piece of technology, or is this about the story? And if you're being distracted by the tool, then it's not doing the job.
Yeah. And Guy, as we talked about earlier, a very successful museum. You've had your visitor numbers are steady, but yet you always are looking to improve. You've been improving for the past, several decades, and you just outlined a major expansion and new experience that's in the book or that's coming up. Why do you see that need to continuously upgrade and improve?
Well, I want us to be ahead of the audience, and that the audience will not get tired of us. And with everything happening in the world, there's more and more challenges for being an attraction. Like they're on computers and internet, and I'm afraid that some of the audience, if we don't have any interesting objects, interesting places to go, they will not come at all. So it's basically about, first of all, that the audience will come also in the future, but also to be better. We've in our research, we find new things. We want to be more relevant. So I think also to keep the staff that we have, to have our own, keep the motivation in our jobs. We need to find new things, do things, but also always keep it according to the stories we're telling. So we can't wave outside that, but we want the challenges, and we want the audience to be happy.
So Sarner's been with you for the past decade or so on your various upgrades, and you talk about I think Ed, you talked earlier about that Geyer has a really nice balance of being able to be focused on the story, but also the bigger vision of what it means to create a successful visitor experience. How why do you continue to work together, and how do you challenge one another? Just how has that relationship worked over the past decade?
We talked to several companies before we started working with Sarner, and what they had, they were so full of themselves, and they didn't listen to what we wanted. And I don't think we are very easy to work with. We have extremely specific ideas, and we have strong beliefs in ideas we have. And it's nice to have a group that, first of all, they believe in you, and they trust that you have done your research and that it will be relevant and that the audience will like the project. But also, they are able to bring it. They have the technical knowledge and the historical knowledge and the theatrical knowledge and lighting, sound, everything that can bring our visions into facts. And when you have that relationship, I think it's dangerous to go outside, because then you have to start over again. And we can't have people spending 2 years to read the story before they start writing for us. So instead, we write the stories and write the scripts, and then we communicate with the technical supplier. And it has worked really well for us, and we're proud of the result.
So Ed, what about you? What's been the most satisfying thing about working with Geyer and his team over the last decade?
I think Guy said it, the results. Sometimes the process is fun, sometimes it's not. It's painful is too strong a word, but it's challenging. But I think that ultimately we really believe in what they're trying to do at the museum. As I meant it when I was saying about Gaia's fantastic balance, seeing the use of the detail, of the accuracy, and I think that's what pays off in bringing these things to life. They're not fairground attractions where you start to lose the trust or authenticity. We're always very much taking the audience with us on this journey because they can have some faith in what they're seeing is accurate, is well researched, but they are designed to engage. And Guy's also mentioned the focus on families, not just a particular set who would be interested in any way, but engaging the youth is absolutely critical. So we love that, and we love the results that we see, and most of all we love the reaction that we see from the visitors too.
Well, gentlemen, unfortunately we're out of time. I've really enjoyed talking with you today, and thank you so much for sharing your story about how you brought this innovative and immersive project to life. And congratulations again on receiving this Thea Award for Excellence.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
So what I love about the Fram Museum is how they use a variety of immersive environments to bring their history to life. Our next project does the same, and does so through a series of stunning theatrical environments. Regardless of one's belief, the subject of religion is very personal. So how do you present a religious story within a museum setting in a way that still connects to guests in a personal manner? The answer is to completely immerse them and take them on an unforgettable and emotional journey. Joining us to tell the story of the Hebrew Bible experience are Rena Oper, Director of Exhibits for the Museum of the Bible, and Matthew Solari, Creative Director for BRC Imagination Arts. Rena and Matthew, welcome and congratulations on receiving this Thea Award for Excellence.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Thank you.
So if you guys could just give us a quick background on the development process and how this whole project came together.
Well, thank you so much. And on behalf of Museum of the Bible, we are honored to be presenting this exhibit and case study alongside BRC Imagination Arts, a firm that has been the most extraordinary partner in helping us achieve our vision of the experience being recognized today. Museum of the Bible's mission is to invite all people to engage with the history, narrative, and impact of the Bible. This is, of course, an ambitious endeavor. How do we create spaces that invite people of all backgrounds to feel safe engaging in the study of a topic that is oftentimes so charged? How do we ensure that each person finds something that resonates with them and that isn't skewed to a particular perspective? And, of course, how do we maximize what a museum can do, which is to immerse visitors in a storytelling environment that is all-encompassing of the content being presented? So those were some of the easy questions and challenges that we handed to BRC to take on. Matt will describe how digging into those questions and the many others that followed and the collaboration they had with our institution and the scholars really contributed to the incredible work we're honoring today. But I will continue to contextualize it right now within the rest of the museum before Matt drills into this project. The museum's permanent galleries are split into three main narratives. Our history floor traces the development of the written texts that became the books of the Bible. It documents the history of its canonization, eventual translation, and global spread. Our impact floor is divided between the impact of the Bible in America and Bible in the world, taking on subjects such as the Bible's impact on the civil rights movement, on art, film, healthcare, education, and more. And of course, there is our stories floor, where visitors learn about the actual narratives of the Bible, both from the New Testament and the Hebrew Bible, which brings us to our topic, the Hebrew Bible walkthrough experience. Now, while I wasn't there for the creation of this exhibit, which was completely put together and installed before the museum opened, I have inherited it and have had the pleasure of watching the public respond to it. Here you'll see that in the 14 months of data collection represented here, the walkthrough is the highest rated experience in the museum. And in fact, our new survey, which we just implemented since reopening a few weeks ago, better differentiates this experience in its questions and now has it leading at 30%. So by all accounts, our objectives have been achieved. In looking through all the qualitative data on it, this experience is the one that, even many weeks after visiting, visitors felt stood out to them as the highlight and most memorable experience of the museum. I believe that is the case because of its attention to both scholarship and showmanship, a quote that I have borrowed from BRC, but with which we at the museum completely agree. So I will turn it to Matt now to take you through the design process for this experience.
Architect William McDonough has said that design is the first signal of human intention. Today I'm going to share with you the intention behind the Hebrew Bible experience and how that intention manifested itself in its design and storytelling. Now, the Bible is often referred to as the greatest story ever told, and for good reason. It's a storyteller's dream. It's got everything you want: epic drama, intrigue, murder, catastrophe, humor, beauty, inspiration, and love. Now, the project was ultimately shaped and molded into its final form by three competing forces: the building, capacity, and the narrative. Now, the building is an historic structure with massive columns every 20 feet in every direction. Not something you want for a theatrical experience. We nicknamed it the Forest of Columns. We had 15,000 square feet in which to tell this epic story. Now, that may seem like a good amount of space, but it's worth noting that the Hebrew Bible is not a single book. It's a compilation of 24 different types of books by different authors compiled over a very long period of time. For Christians, the Old Testament has 39 books for Protestants, 46 books for Catholics, and 49 books for Eastern Orthodox. The experience is comprised of 5 mini theaters and 10 walk-through environments. Those columns are completely hidden behind walls. Groups of up to 35 people are pulsed through a winding passageway every 6 minutes. At any given moment, there could be up to 6 groups somewhere in the queue without converging, producing an experience that feels both epic and intimate without sacrificing critical visitor throughput targets. Each group feels as though they are the only ones in the attraction. It's essentially a dark ride without the ride vehicle. In fact, we were inspired by Disneyland's Pirates of the Caribbean ride in the way that it unfolds a story and efficiently uses compact spaces. But unlike a ride system where everyone moves at the same pace, here guests can set their own pace. Now, the biggest challenge was how to approach the story. Stories are powerful things. They can be used to divide us, or they can inspire the better angels of our nature. We had many, many sleepless nights on this project, but nothing had us more terrified than our own blind spots, the unknown unknowns. Our intention was to provide an experience where people of all faiths and no faith tradition can engage with the narratives of the Bible on their own terms. We would do this by emphasizing universal values of faith, home, love, family, and forgiveness. But first, we had to be willing to unlearn everything we thought we knew. A diverse team of international scholars and rabbis helped us through this process and rebuilt our understanding of the Bible from the ground up. The museum's director of content, Dr. Seth Pollinger, did a masterful job at helping us to translate scholarship notes into story. It was an eye-opening process and showed us just how spotty and incorrect our prior knowledge was. So with that, let's take a walk through the journey. You enter a plain space for what looks like a standard museum presentation. On the wall is an old scroll. This lackluster design was intentional. We did not want to give away any hint of what was to come. The presentation begins. Our storyteller appears behind the scroll, inviting you to see beyond the parchment and ink, to look within, to experience the story of a people and their relationship with one God. He blows out his lamp, and out of the darkness comes a blinding burst of light. The scroll disappears behind an interpretive vision of the creation story. If this were the Old Testament, the climax of the creation story would be Adam and Eve eating the forbidden fruit. But original sin is not a Jewish concept. Rather, the breaking of perfect unity between God, humankind, and creation is a series of choices that finds its darkest expression when violence enters the world, the moment when Cain kills his brother Abel. This widens the fissure between God and humankind and literally cracks the wall around the scroll. And it takes guests a beat to realize that the entire side wall of the room has opened up, revealing a hidden passageway. Now, sometimes it takes guests a moment for some brave soul to stand up and start walking into the unknown. Now, here we've given you all the narrative you need for the moment. So now you proceed at your own pace through the first 3 non-narrative immersive environments. Like the characters in our story, you're plunged into a world in chaos where we evoke humankind's descent into violence through theatrical lighting, oblique walls, and dramatic music. From here on out, each space will have its own musical score and distinct visual approach, as if each space was conceived by a different artist. These immersive spaces activate the imagination and elicit deep emotional responses. Next, turning a corner, you pass a 3D tableau in layered glass depicting Noah being called to build an ark before entering the next space, the Great Flood. Here, rather than creating a literal ark, we created an impressionistic interpretation. Stacked crates featuring animals and Bible passages tower over you like cresting waves. Surrounding you are the sounds of frightened animals and creaking wood as the storm rages all around you outside. Then darkness and fear give way to light and hope as you enter a new beginning. With no visible light sources, you literally step inside a cascading rainbow, the biblical symbol of God's promise to never again destroy the world. Now, you've gone as far as you can go without losing the narrative thread. We need to stop you here and share the next bit of the story. This is essentially the middle of Act 2, but we now have a big plot twist coming and a cavalcade of new characters to introduce. It is the worst possible time for exposition. And it's for these reasons that the second mini-theater is the most important and narratively challenging. Frank Capra said, "There are no rules in filmmaking, only sins. And the cardinal sin is dullness. If it's dull, we will lose the audience and never get them back. We have to pull out all the stops. It needs to have a great setting, a dramatic story arc, and a wow special effect." So our setting is a desert tent where strangers are often welcomed with hospitality and stories. You hear the delicate sounds of the night as you enter. A breeze blows the canvas walls. The wooden posts gently creak. The firelight outside the tent flickers, creating dancing shadows on the tent. And there we have our setting. This is the story of Abraham. It's the foundation story of the 3 major monotheistic religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. The narrative spans 1,500 years, from Abraham to Moses. That's a lot of plot to cover in only 5 minutes. We would use the flickering shadows on the tent walls to visualize the story. This solved 2 big challenges at once. First, the fluid nature of the shadows allows us to move rapidly and fluidly from one moment to the next. Second, we're able to be culturally sensitive by not visualizing the characters in the story. Our storyteller brings the audience up to speed. In a nutshell, the world after the Great Flood continues to rebel. So in a surprise move, God reaches out to a childless man and his wife, Abraham and Sarah. God establishes a covenant, an unbreakable promise. They will be given descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky, and through their family, all people will be blessed. Basically here, God is providing humankind a new path home. The family continues with Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. But the key thing is, the stories of the sacrifice of Isaac and Sodom and Gomorrah end up on the cutting room floor. They take us off of the main story path, not to mention they're potentially divisive and really too complex to unpack here in this setting. So the family grows, and eventually the Israelites, as they're now called, are enslaved in Egypt. The story reaches its climax when Moses is called by God to free them and bring them home. And at that moment, a previously unseen bush in the corner of the room erupts into flame. It is a great magic trick that produces lots of wide eyes and open mouths. So with some narrative discipline, evocative placemaking, and a real burning bush, we successfully avoid the cardinal sin of boring the audience. So up to this point, we have treated guests to a series of visual feasts. Now it's time to give their eyes a rest and put their imagination to work. Everyone who visits the Hebrew Bible Experience has their own personal favorite room, and this one is mine. It's our third mini theater, and it imagines the first Passover as a Son Lumiere show. In the center of an otherwise empty room is an unfinished sculpture depicting a family that appears to be partially carved out of the trunk of an olive tree. And imagine the fear, the anticipation of freedom. The sculpture seems to evoke both contrasting emotions at once. You're there on that night, experiencing it for yourself. Our storyteller narrates Moses' confrontation with Pharaoh. You hear the frightening plagues and a stunning 360-degree sound. And as the final plague, death, rages around outside, we're reminded that we are safe here inside God's protection. Come the dawn, Pharaoh's hard heart is broken, and he agrees to let the Israelites go. A door to a new passage then opens, flooding the space with blue, shimmering light. Our storyteller begs us to leave quickly before Pharaoh changes his mind. Story-wise, you're all caught up again. In front of you are 4 more emotionally evocative walk-through spaces to be explored. Towering walls made out of taut cording are bathed with shimmering blue light that evoke Moses' parting of the Red Sea in Exodus. The pathway then opens up to Mount Sinai. A stenciled light box representing the Ark of the Covenant is suspended in the middle of the room. A single light source in the center of the box sprays the entire room, walls, floor, ceiling, people, everything, with the word of God's commandments in Hebrew and in English. Now, at this point in the journey, the Israelites wander the desert for 40 years. But it only takes you a few moments to cross the Jordan River, depicted here by 12 stacked stones inscribed with the name of each tribe. Now in Hollywood, that might be the end of the story. But here, the tribes of Israel essentially get caught in a constant redo loop. The Israelites forget their covenant with God, which makes them vulnerable to invasion. They cry out for deliverance. A military leader called a judge comes forth to vanquish their enemies and bring them back to God. That's the cycle. It repeats itself over and over again for 400 years. Now, some judges you might recognize are Gideon, Deborah, and Samson. But here, instead of focusing too much on the story, which kind of gets repetitive and complex, we focus on the emotion, the sense of fracture and peril that is embodied in the design and lighting of the space. And incidentally, this is the only place in the experience where we provide you just a little bit of narrative text if you want to get some of the backstory. And then from here, we then ask the scholars, which story best embodies the themes of the Hebrew Bible? And they all cited the book of Ruth. This is a story of love and devotion that expresses the heart of the Torah, another name for the Hebrew Bible. It's also a linchpin story for Christians. So naturally, Ruth got her own mini theater. And the gist of it is that during the time of the judges, Ruth, a Moabite, leaves everything she knows, her family, her home, and her gods, to care for her destitute mother-in-law in the land of the Israelites, in the town of Bethlehem. Ruth is blessed by God for her devotion, and eventually her great-grandson, David, unites the tribes and becomes king of Israel. Now, many Christian guests bring with them the knowledge that the family line of Ruth and David lead to Jesus of Nazareth. But because this is the Hebrew Bible and not the Old Testament, we omit that point narratively and let the audience fill in the blanks themselves. So in the final space, we tell the story of David and the rise and fall of the kingdom of Israel. We project a loose painterly animation style on the walls that gives the sense of an artist creating the visuals in real time as the story unfolds. Narratively, this was a challenging nut to crack and the last piece to finally come together. It's now been about 25 minutes since you started your journey. You've covered a lot of narrative territory. Now, how do we keep the audience engaged so they remember what they've seen and put the pieces together? So we came up with a clever solution. Our storyteller would use the first 20 seconds to effectively recap the major story points that lead you up to this moment, while visually connecting them to the immersive walkthrough spaces that you've just gone through. So great, everyone is now up to speed again. So how do we end a book that has no traditional ending? Well, the Hebrew Bible basically stops with the fall of Jerusalem, followed later by the king of Persia, allowing the exiled Israelites to return and rebuild the temple. That's fine for scripture, but not for an attraction. It doesn't create as much of a satisfying conclusion as we want. Through a stroke of inspiration from my BRC colleague, Kat Reinbold, we landed on an idea that brings the story full circle. It was the job of the prophet Ezra to preserve and to tell the story so people would remember. So as the second temple is being built, Ezra takes out his scroll and starts reading from the beginning passages of Genesis. This is when we realize we are the audience in his story. Ezra unfurls his scroll and takes us all the way back to where we started, in the beginning. The room fills with stars, and on the wall before us appears the scroll that began our journey 25 minutes ago. And now I will show you how this all came together.
I didn't realize how they would be more than just a depiction, more than just a reenactment, but actually a transportation to that place and to that event. The highlights for me in this exhibit were my heart thumping and my knees shaking.
Matt and Rena, thanks for that behind-the-scenes look at really what is a beautiful interpretation of a complex subject. With our remaining time, I've got a number of questions, and I'd like to start with you, Rena. You'd mentioned earlier that you came to the museum after it's opened, so you got to see the Hebrew Bible experience first as a visitor. What were your impressions?
I was really blown away. It's always hard as a museum professional to look at any exhibit just through the eyes of a visitor, but as somebody who is seeing it both ways, I really felt like this exhibit was taking museum experience to the next level through its immersiveness, through its technology. So I found that very exciting. And then on the other level, I really appreciated the storytelling that they did in this exhibit. It was sensitive, it was scholarly, and so it really helped me see the framework of where the museum was coming from, what they were looking to achieve. And so it's been very satisfying to actually get to come work here and represent that and see how it resonates with our visitors.
And Matt, so you show up to work one morning at the BRC studios and you're told, hey, we want you and your colleagues to create an engaging experience based on the Bible. Kind of a daunting task. What were the challenges in working with a subject matter that's so broad, that's been studied and interpreted by so many people for eons?
So our biggest challenge was getting the content and the story right, being able to see the story with new eyes, and avoiding what I described in the presentation as the unknown unknowns was really the biggest challenge. We had to really listen a lot to the scholars. And as I mentioned, they spent a lot of time really breaking us down, helping us to let go of our preconceived ideas about the subject matter. Every person who approaches the subject has their own personal feelings about it, their own personal connections, and their own personal knowledge. And we realized very early that none of us saw the Bible and the stories within it the same way. And so the working with the scholars was an absolutely fascinating process. Each one had a different expertise, whether it be archaeology, anthropology, theology, looking at it from the perspective of as a Christian text, as a Jewish text, and we really had to understand it from so many different perspectives in order to then to be able to simplify it and boil it down. And we realized very early on that since it's not a traditional narrative like in any books or collection of books that we would think of today, we had to find a through line so that we could take the audience on a journey that makes sense to them. And we landed upon the idea of this physical journey, actually, and oftentimes a spiritual journey that takes these people from one place, which is this place of perfect unity with God, humankind, and creation, which we think of as the Garden of Eden, take them out of that, and now they're thrust in a situation where their journey is about a return to some form of home, whether it be a physical place or a spiritual place. So all the stories that we tell along the way hew to that journey, which isn't incorrect. It's one of many ways that you can find your way into the stories of the Bible. But this one really lent itself well to a physical journey that the guests take as they leave their first space and go through 16 different scenes all the way to the very end. That was our biggest challenge and the one that kept us up at night.
So, and I want to talk a little bit more about the stories that you selected and the stories that you chose to omit. I mean, you've got this wealth of material to work from. How did you choose which stories that you were going to talk about within the experience, and how did you choose which ones you said it's okay to not go into this one?
Yes. Well, since we had our journey now set for us, which was the idea of this journey to home, right? These people, our story, are journeying home. All of our stories had to really fit on that line, that red thread. And if they didn't, we let them go. We had so many interesting discussions. One of my favorite stories is the story of Esther, and she's an iconic character. She's a queen. She ends up saving the Jewish people from massacre, and it's a great capstone for the entire experience. It happens toward the end of the Hebrew Bible, and it also is the beginning of the diaspora of the Jewish people from Israel out into the larger world. So I thought, this is great. It just sends people out there. But once we started to look at it in terms of the entire journey and the entire experience, it started to show cracks. And we had one of the world's foremost scholars on Esther on our team. And he looked at the work that we put, and we were so excited. And he said, you're going to find this hard to believe coming from me, but I think you should get rid of Esther. And I said, why? She's a great character. It's a great dramatic ending. He's like, yeah, but it doesn't fulfill your story. If this is a story about a journey homeward, she doesn't get you there. So we had to let her go. As much as we wanted to keep her in its place, you see what we led you through, which was we actually then ended up using Ezra as our storyteller. And he brings you home back to Jerusalem at the building of the second temple, which brings it full circle. So we basically had to have really, really strong narrative discipline and not get too in love with any particular story if it didn't serve our needs. And also sometimes, too, a story is so complex, you can't really get too deep into this type of experience, like the story of the sacrifice of Isaac or Sodom and Gomorrah, which are actually much more complex than people actually realize and might not even mean the things that people think they do. But this wasn't the place to unpack those stories. And hopefully, if we ignited some curiosity in guests, that they would want to go on and continue to find out more themselves.
And Rena, you have the benefit of being at the museum every day, so you get to see visitors coming out of this amazing experience, and I'm sure they have a ton of questions. What are some of those questions, and how do you answer them?
Well, it's interesting. A lot